Hello. This week we move into looking at an era which has considerable impact in our roles as leaders in the church today. Not because it was particularly theologically profound, but because it created a number of expectations and assumptions about what normal in the church looks like. Those attitudes and opinions, often unreflected, appear today in attitudes towards the success or failure, popularity or not of the church and its ministries. Many of us deal with the built reminder of that era, the remaining buildings and properties and so on. And it's often helpful to recognize that the assumptions we so often encounter, and the assumptions we may have ourselves, are based on a historic anomaly. An anomaly is defined as something that deviates from what is standard, normal, or expected. And the situation of the church after the Second World War was just such an anomaly, as we will explore. However, people who lived through that anomaly as their only experience will come to see it as being the norm. They see it as the way things should be, and they tend to judge subsequent events in light of that experience. But if the experience was an anomaly, then those judgments will be off. Many observers have commented on the fact that the period following the war, 1945 to 1965, was the greatest North American religious revival ever. Men and women who had shown little interest in the church before the war flocked to it in numbers that confounded the forecasters. There was a boom in attendance, membership, financial support, periodical subscriptions, and book sales. It began with doubling and then quadrupling Sunday school enrollments, then the parents followed the children, leading to a boom in adult education. And this resulted in a building spree, often in the new suburbs where there had previously been no churches. And so between 1945 and 1966, the United Church of Canada built 1,500 churches and church halls and 600 manses. Put that another way, for 2 decades, we broke ground on a new church building every 2 weeks. So, what was the nature of this growth? Well, in fact, it was largely socially conservative and nostalgic at its roots. And so, evangelists like Billy Graham and Charles Templeton were popular. Many people sought to restore the oftentimes idealized favorable aspects of pre war Canadian life. Church and Sunday school were part of that mix. If I can borrow an image from another country, think of a Norman Rockwell view of the world. The image that post war Canadians often created of pre war Canada was like that. It was also an era when the Cold War and the reality of nuclear proliferation were very high in people's minds and created anxiety. And so it was a time when people deeply desired normalcy, not novelty, reassurance, and not challenge. So, in the United Church of Canada, in terms of social policies, that translated into ongoing denominational opposition to drinking, gambling, pornography, and horse racing on Sunday. And with every denomination in Canada doing well financially and numerically, there was little incentive for any innovative styles of interchurch relationships. There were desultory talks between the United Church of Canada and the Anglicans, but those produced very few results. Visitors to Canada often remarked on the degree to which the churches were thriving on the capital of the past. That translated to Sunday mornings when churches and Sunday schools were crowded, but Sunday evening belonging to Ed Sullivan. And the new life in Sunday school brought little interest for weekday communion or the Wednesday evening prayer meeting. Now, I don't mean to imply that those who were part of the post-war boom were only interested in getting, by no means. For instance, there was an explosion in men's work in service and study and inspirational activities. The structures of the church sought to keep before members social realities such as mental health, problems confronting aging and pensioners, family life dangers of materialism, and so on. A commission on Christian marriage and the Christian home was appointed in 1944 to try and address the changing realities of life. Another response was an upsurge in couples clubs and special family services, at the same time as publicly deploring the employment of mothers outside the home because of the impact it had on children. The church was not immune to the radical challenging and change that characterized Canadian society in the 1960s. Institutionally, there was a great deal of energy and money being poured into paying off the new church plants of the 1950s, so that resources for innovation and for new mission were actually quite slim. The Sunday school graduates of the 1950s showed very little interest in the youth groups of the 1960s. Interest in religion was contrasted with, quote, an endless relativity in faith and morals, end of quotation. The clergy, on the other hand, struggled against role models in which society cast them, but for which it had very little use. For example, the bumbling vicar, the sheltered pious person with their head constantly in the cloud, the nice person incapable of confronting life's harsher realities. And so after the post-war boom, what was happening was that worship attendance and finances were merely leveling off. They weren't returning to the pre-war levels. They were still higher than that. But a common memory of relentless growth in the post-war era saw such plateauing as actually a failure. And social rituals such as the Stanley Cup and the Grey Cup and the Calgary Stampede clearly meant more to many Canadians than did the rituals of religion. In 1960, the General Council was forced to face reality and, while maintaining that abstinence was the wisest and safest course, admitted that responsible church members took a drink now and then. This represents the first official acknowledgement about what many realized were the case. The church's life in the new social context sparked a variety of responses. There were lots of new worship resources. There were new service and hymn books in the United Church. Many denominations developed new church curricula, some new church school curricula. The core, or new curriculum, came into use faster and more widely than the publishers dared hope. This United Church of Canada publication sold 600,000 of the adult resource books, 600,000 of the adult resource books in the first summer. And total sales far outstripped United Church of Canada Sunday School registration, which means that the United Church Sunday School curriculum was being taken up in other denominations. Institutionally, the church began to rationalize struggling rural congregations into pastoral charges. That resulted in much ongoing bitterness. In 1962, the Women's Missionary Society and the Women's Association joined to form the United Church Women. In many ways, this is what observers refer to as a response to an aberrant time. In other words, in the 1960s, we see the church emerging from a time in Canadian history where a series of factors came together in an unusual convergence. Think of the period between 1928 and 1945. Two major events which required a tremendous degree of subjugating the individual to the greater needs of society. Both the Depression and especially the Second World War were efforts on a national scale. And so individuals became schooled in a pattern of setting aside individual differences for the sake of the larger cause. They learned to find their identity in organizations and institutions. Membership became a key social factor, and if you asked somebody who they would often identify themselves by naming where they were members: churches, social clubs, professional associations, and so on. At the same time, once the war was over, there were significant resources that were freed up through different industries and institutions. And so that meant that there was a freedom to innovate and explore and try new ideas in industry, commerce, government, and the church. Governments were flush with cash, and so they were able to expand at a great rate. There was money flowing into the churches, and the post-war baby boom created a demand for churches and for social services. The large number of non-church social organizations that are familiar today had not yet come into being, and so the churches were the focus of many recreational and social activities, as well as more purely spiritual and religious observations. And government collaborated in this form of socialization through legislation that heavily restricted other activities, particularly commercial activities, on Sunday. After the upheaval and the disruption of the previous decade and a half, the post-war generation of Canadians were desperate for conformity and social calm. Furthermore, the generally positive economic circumstances and the flow of consumer goods that followed the retooling of wartime factories, all this meant that there was a widespread sense of prosperity and satisfaction. It clearly didn't reach into all corners of the country, but in the dominant view of society, things were going pretty well. And this was contrasted with the reality of the Cold War and the fear of the spread of communism that reinforced conformity. Now, this post-war social consensus began to fray as Canada moved into the 1960s. The absence of a grand national cause allowed for a flourishing of individual expression and for the surfacing of disdain for the rigid role definitions of a previous generation. Both through immigration and travel, Canadians were experiencing a wider world, which brought with it, amongst other things, an awareness of the breadth of religious and spiritual options. Many churches and church leaders who were raised in a more conformist time were ill-equipped to deal with a society that was apparently comfortable questioning everything. In 1960, the United Church of Canada had 143 personnel in 38 mission statements in Africa, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, and Trinidad. In addition, the WMS was sponsoring 200 missionary women at home and abroad. During this period of time, the loss of the mission in China, which had been quite important in Canadian Protestant self-identity, and particularly in the United Church of Canada, when that mission was closed out because of the success of the Communist Revolution, that raised a lot of questions. What was it about communism that made it more appealing than Christianity? And all of those questions were swirling around. There was the gradual shift to the view of instead of sending missionaries to bring the light, to send partners. And so, increasingly in this period of time, the receiving churches elsewhere in the world were specifying their needs. And those were often in the fields of management, engineering, and teaching rather than in spreading the gospel as missionary work is traditionally thought of. There was also a shift to the idea that the mission field was right here, that we had very comfortably for many years thought of the mission field as being someplace somewhere else, to where we sent people. And the developing idea was that in the change of society, the end of that period of history known as Christendom, the mission field for the Christian story was actually right outside the church door. There were union talks with the Anglicans, and principles of union and a plan of union document were developed but never adopted. And then there were the union talks with the Evangelical United Brethren, which ended with the joining of the EUB into the United Church of Canada in 1968. A major event for the United Church of Canada in this decade was the publication of the so-called new or core curriculum. And this was a triumph of cutting-edge educational methods joined with up-to-date positions in biblical studies. For many people, both inside and outside the church, it was a breath of fresh air. For many more, especially within the church, it was the dynamiting of many of the foundational principles of their Christian faith. There was nothing in the new curriculum which would surprise anyone with a theological education. The introduction of the results of historical, critical, biblical thinking rocked many lay people. Many lay people were used to a generally mildly literist understanding of Scripture. By that I mean, if pushed, most United Church members would agree that Genesis 1 and 2 did not offer accurate scientific accounts of the origins of life on earth, but they were not often pushed. The general historicity and unity of the First Testament text was pretty widely accepted. Most people accepted that these were generally an accurate record of what happened and that it was a unified text. And that literal acceptance expanded and hardened when the focus shifted to the gospel. Many who read the Gospels accepted them as being biographies of Jesus. Many who then attended classes in the newly emerging university departments of religion were exposed to elaborate explanations of how miraculous events in Scripture really were natural phenomena poorly understood by the more simple people of the time. In other words, they were real events showing God at work in the world, rather than miraculous, which was defined as unnatural and inexplicable. In essence, the effort was made to bridge the gaps between science and religion by arguing that the former was another way of seeing God at work. For many people, the content of the new curriculum was their first exposure to long accepted items from the theological catalog of knowledge. For instance, the differences between the Gospels, why they were there, and the reality that the writers were not immediate disciples of Jesus came as quite a shock to people. The questioning of the tradition of the one-time mass exodus from Egypt a la Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments. The acknowledgement that certain elements in Acts were actually more mythological than historical. The recognition that the Gospels are not biography, and so on. While there were those who found this liberating, There were many who experienced it as profoundly challenging and unwelcome. It undermined their certainty. In a society that quite naturally equated true with factual, it sounded a lot like saying the Bible was not true. Another question that all of this raised was, what does evangelism mean if it doesn't mean revivalism? If it doesn't mean revival meetings and handing out tracts door to door, what does it mean to share the good news of Jesus? How do we help people in an increasingly materialist society make connection with spiritual realities? What does that look like in a society which is increasingly oriented towards respecting a variety and less inclined to call other views, particularly in religion, heresy or lack of truth? Simultaneously to all of this, in many of its official pronouncements, the various levels of the United Church government began to move away from the familiar language of faith. Church leaders increasingly saw themselves as trying to engage with individuals and institutions in Canadian society for whom traditional religious terminology lacked any particular relevance. The inside language of the church made little impact when the church was seeking to speak to education or to government. So, while on the one hand United Church worship goers were hearing and singing the familiar language of sin and redemption and salvation and so on, their church was increasingly using the language of social sciences, where much worship and spirituality were very much still individually centered. The wider church was using far more systemic language, where the congregation and society were very much pictured marching arm in arm. The General Council was much more vocal in criticizing what it saw as government failures involving marginalized groups. Where capitalism was often unquestionably accepted as the final and finest social expression of Christian values, church voices were increasingly calling out its failures and taking a stance over against accepted institutions. Many more traditional members could not figure out what Christianity, which they understood as being personal and private and related more to heaven than perhaps to earth, what that Christianity had to do with social issues like the Vietnam War, nuclear armaments, pollution, systemic poverty, and so on. And these differences were also caught up in theological education as students divided themselves off as Barthians and Bultmannians, and they were introduced to emerging practices in the social sciences and counseling. So, in the end, while the United Church ended the 1960s still appearing quite strong in various quantitative measures, there were fissures that were beginning to appear in the structure. The last year of membership growth was 1965. Different patterns were emerging, which were captured in new service books and a new hymn book published early in the 1970s. What was to become a long-term pattern of shining a light of faith on and social research on institutions like the family and celebrating a breadth of social expression, that had begun. Engagements with churches in different parts of the world were beginning to impact the long-standing view of North America as a source of the gospel for, quote, a world in darkness. And that change of view would change those relationships profoundly and draw the church into various liberation struggles. We were caught in the dilemma of, if our brothers and sisters in Christ in various countries are caught up in liberation from colonial powers of which we are representatives, where do we find our place? One of the greatest impacts of this period is felt in today's congregations, when many in leadership and many in the pews may look to the 1950s and the 1960s as the golden age or the norm by which everything else should be measured. However, as we've seen, the church of that period was the product of social and institutional factors that had not existed beforehand and cannot be recreated. And so thinking of an aberrant era as a model and a norm continues to afflict churches today.